Hi, and welcome to this live reading from Flame and Crystal Thorns, The Fae and Crystal Thorns, book number 1 by K.L. Moody, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. For someone who had once visited Faerie, Chloe found strange comfort in the simplicity of the mortal realm. A crackling fire in one corner warmed her small sitting room. She sat in a plush chair with a leather-bound notebook perched open on her lap. The feather quill she used to take notes often left smudges of ink on her fingers. Today's smudges were especially dark. Across from her, a neighbor woman whose dark hair had turned mostly gray sniffled. She kept dabbing her eyes, but a few tears still escaped her embroidered handkerchief. Chloe tapped her quill against a notebook page as she felt her mouth screw into a knot. "And did you say your husband developed a fever along with his rash?" "Yes, but—" The woman's lip quivered, slow at first until it shook as fast as a lone leaf clinging to a tree amidst an icy winter wind. She squeezed her handkerchief as if it might save her from pain. It's not a normal fever? I know it's not. Everyone says it's winter sickness and that the rash will soon be gone, but I'm certain it is something much worse." Before the woman could soak her handkerchief with a puddle of tears, Chloe reached across the space between them until her hand dropped over the woman's. "Mrs. Nash, I agree with you. This does not sound like winter sickness." The lightest flicker of hope sparked in the woman's red-rimmed eyes. With a nod, Chloe sat deeper into her plush velvet chair. No weaver in the mortal realm could craft such fine material as the rich maroon velvet of Chloe's sitting-room furniture. Luckily, everyone in town spent too much time whispering about the strange stories Chloe's nieces and nephews told, or about the inhuman color of her brother's eyes, to worry about her too fine furniture. Her gaze swept across her notebook, scanning the notes she had taken. "I'll need to do a bit of research, but I am certain I can find a remedy for your husband." "Truly?" Mrs. Nash sat forward in her seat with eyes as wide as clocks. Chloe snapped the notebook closed before standing up. "There is a reason I've gained the reputation as best apothecary in town. I am certain I can help." The woman clutched her handkerchief tight as she brought her hand over her heart. Tears welled in her eyes. Reaching out a hand to help the woman up, Chloe donned a light smile. "You can return to your home now. I'll do my research, then I'll fix something up and bring it to your home later tonight." Tears slid down Mrs. Nash's splotchy red cheeks as she got to her feet. "Thank you." She took a few steps, but then turned back. Shadows from the fire danced across her face as she inhaled deeply. I know you only moved here because your parents died and your older brother was the only family you had left, but—" She shook her head. It's awful about your parents, truly awful, but—" Her chin trembled as she attempted to steady her breathing. "I don't know what would happen to my husband without you. I'm so glad you're here and not wherever you used to live." At least the woman had refrained from asking exactly where Chloe used to live. Chloe and her younger sister always evaded those questions as skillfully as possible. How else could they explain that they used to live not just in a different town, but also in a different time? Having a Fae brother who masqueraded as a mortal certainly made life difficult to explain. By mortal standards, he wasn't even her brother. They did share blood, though, which still made him family, and since Faerie had no time, he was able to bring Chloe and her sister back to the mortal realm to live with him after their parents' deaths. Even more important, her brother's wife and their children knew about his true Fae nature. Maybe her nieces and nephews' stories sounded strange and outlandish to outsiders, but those in her house knew how true they really were. A tight smile stretched across Chloe's face as she waved goodbye to Mrs. Nash. The woman had been too deep in her grief to notice Chloe's tension at the mention of her parents and her previous town. Chloe gripped her notebook a little too tight as she made her way down the hall leading to her workroom. This entire wing of the house had been added when Chloe and her younger sister Grace moved in. Her Fae brother had done it all in one night, which took almost no work at all, since he could conjure clothing, gold, and even buildings with his Fae magic. What did take work was trying to convince the people in town that the extra wing had been there all along. People had whispered about it for months. In the end, they all collectively agreed their memories had to be faulty, since it was clearly impossible for one man to build an entire wing in one night. Impossible for a mortal, maybe, but not for a fae. A wave of earthly scents rushed into Chloe's nose when she opened the door to her workroom. Dried lavender, rosemary, and a few other herbs hung from thin strings tied to the ceiling. Notebooks, loose papers, heavy books, and empty pots of ink littered a work table at one end of the room. On the other work table, herbs and crystals sat next to a stone mortar and pestle. Ignoring both tables, she knelt down and unlatched the trunk in one corner. No matter how many times she opened the trunk, she still held her breath while lifting the lid. The air ignited with an unseen energy. Tingles spread over her skin as she reached into its depths. The tingles only multiplied when her fingers met the book sitting at the bottom. She pulled the suede and leather book cover tight to her chest as she breathed in its mossy scent. She had stolen it from Faerie, which she didn't feel guilty about in the least. Magic pulsed between the pages, but no matter how many times she tried, she could never capture or absorb any of that magic for herself. For good measure, she tugged it even closer and took one last deep breath. Still nothing. Sighing, she stood and set the book onto her work table. After getting comfortably situated, she thumbed through the pages. The book held information on Faerie, including the creatures there, the flora and fauna, a little history, and more. She had skimmed every page multiple times, but with her current occupation, she now usually just referred to the sections on illnesses, injuries, and remedies. Mr. Nash's sickness seemed eerily similar to scurpus. The sickness probably had a different name in the mortal realm, but the book from Faerie called it by its fae name. While fae had healing abilities that could heal almost any sickness without help, they also had a host of remedies that sped up the healing process. Luckily, their remedies worked on mortals, too. Her finger tapped on the book once she found the page for scurpus. She set her notebook right next to it and compared the symptoms. A fever, rash, and excessive weakness were followed by a tinge of gray along the hairline and at the tips of the fingers. Mrs. Nash hadn't mentioned anything about the gray tinge, but it probably wouldn't be long before her husband exhibited that symptom too. A simple poultice could heal him as long as Chloe administered it before the gray tinge in the fingertips spread far enough to reach the palm of his hand. Wiping her hands on the homespun apron protecting her silk dress, Chloe began gathering herbs. After reading the first ingredient off the list, she found it and set it neatly next to the book. Then she moved on to the next ingredient, placing it right next to the first. A wisp of blonde hair fell into her face while she worked, but she just tucked it back into her messy bun. Soon she had nearly all the ingredients gathered. Her finger trailed down the page until she found the last ingredient. The sight of it sent a wrench through her heart. Salt from the fairy court of Swiftsea. Chloe gulped. Swiftsea salt had magical properties that not even the other fairy courts possessed. Her fingers instinctively reached for the hidden pouch under her homespun apron. Tight knots wound in her chest as she touched the drawstring opening. A tiny wave of nausea churned in her belly. But just before she opened the pouch, the knots in her chest loosened. Shaking away her worry, she held her page with one finger and then slipped to the back of the book. She had encountered this problem a few times before. Thanks to an intelligent mortal who had long since dead, an appendix had been added to the book, which gave mortal ingredient substitutions for all the ingredients specific to Faerie. A breath of relief fell from her lips when she found that Swiftsea salt did indeed have substitute ingredients that existed in the mortal realm. Her relief only lasted a moment. She needed juniper, goldenrod, and fennel. She had a few bundles of juniper and a handful of goldenrod, but not the other herb. She hadn't bothered to collect and dry any fennel during the summer since she had never used it before. Without all three of the herbs, she couldn't make a proper substitution for Swiftsea salt. Her mouth went dry as she stared at the page. A part of her hoped staring would change the words in front of her. The book was magic, wasn't it? It came from a magical realm, at least. The hope was fruitless. Of course, the words never changed. If she wanted to save Mr. Nash, she knew what she had to do. Biting her lips, she reached under her apron and opened the small pouch. That same wave of nausea turned her stomach again, even stronger this time. Only a handful of items sat at the bottom of the pouch. It contained a seashell that could make any liquid taste like honey, but even more important, the shell could also cleanse liquids of impurities or even poison. A light purple ribbon cut from a skirt that once belonged to her mother sat next to the shell. There were a few other trinkets, including a loose harp string she probably should have gotten rid of long ago. Last of all, there sat a small bag of swift sea salt. Most of the Faerie items had come from Chloe's older sister, Alora. A lump formed in her throat as she stared at the open pouch. Her sister lived in Faerie now. She occasionally came to the mortal realm to visit, but Chloe still missed her terribly. Seeing the items did the same thing it always did. It made her miss Faerie, too. She let out a wistful sigh as she plopped onto the nearest chair. Chloe hadn't spent long in Faerie, but her time had been filled with adventure. Even 3 years later, she still pined for it sometimes. But Faerie was dangerous. It had all sorts of rules and consequences, many of which could be deadly for a mortal. She had never been the type who loved adventure anyway. Reading epic poems provided as much adventure as she ever wanted from life. Still, the land had been enchanting, beautiful. It had a whole host of magical books just begging to be read. Her eyes slammed shut as she folded her arms over her chest. Not this again. She had already decided she would never return to Faerie. She was mortal. She belonged in the mortal realm. Letting out a heavy breath, she ran through all of the reasons the mortal realm was better for her. Here she'd be able to find someone to fall in love with, someone to grow old with. Not a fae. If she stayed in Faerie and fall in love with a fae, there would be no growing old together. She knew this more intimately than anyone. Her immortal fae brother had been married for years without trouble. But now his mortal wife was starting to age, and he was not. Trouble brewed whether they wanted to admit it or not. Pretty soon, her fae brother would have to start wearing a glamour that made him appear older to match his wife's age. If anyone caught sight of his true face, he might have to leave the mortal realm. Then his wife would be forced to grow old, all alone. Gritting her teeth, Chloe snatched the bag of swift sea salt from her pouch. She would use it for Mr. Nash's poultice, every last bit of it. Yes, it had valuable properties that would keep Fae from enchanting her food, but what did that matter when she never intended to return to Faerie anyway? Despite her surety, it still hurt to see the last sprinkles of her swift sea salt drop into the small wooden bowl she used for mixing. One of her last reminders of Faerie would be gone forever. Her eyes stung as she crushed and cut the other herbs and dropped them into the bowl. The wisp of hair fell into her face again, but she was too busy wiping away a tear to bother with it. The moment of weakness still ached in her throat, but she did her best to focus on her mixie bowl. It didn't take long to finish after that. With the dry ingredients for the poultice secured in a cloth binding inside a small basket, Chloe grabbed her fur-lined cloak and pulled it over her shoulders. Getting to the Nash's house would be easy since they lived just down the lane. Chloe hardly noticed the ice crunching under her boots. Memories of Faerie flitted in her mind, no matter how she tried to shake them away. The moon shone bright in the sky, lighting the path ahead. When she arrived at the house next to the large ash tree at the end of the lane, she knocked hard on the front door. Mrs. Nash answered it, her eyes now puffy and swollen. The woman ushered Chloe into a dark room lit only by a fire in the fireplace. "Here he is," she whispered, the words as if speaking out loud might upset her ill husband. The man's eyes snapped open. His gaze darted around the room while fear seized his features. But once he caught sight of his wife, the tightness of his muscles vanished with a relieved exhale. "Muriel." His fingers shook as he attempted to lift his hand from the bed he rested on. The weakness plaguing him prevented him from bringing his hand more than a palm's length above the blankets. Just as Chloe had suspected, the slightest tinge of gray dappled his fingertips. After another moment, his hand dropped heavily back onto the bed. Mrs. Nash rushed to his bedside and took his hand in both of hers. She squeezed it and then brushed the hair off his forehead. A tinge of gray stretched along his hairline. Her whisper came out even gentler than before. "Don't you worry. Miss Chloe Rosenbell is here to make you feel better, just like I promised. She continued to speak soothing words to her husband while Chloe opened the poultice and added water to make a thick paste. Once ready, she spread the paste over the man's chest. With each movement, Mrs. Nash spoke gently to her husband and offered comfort. Warmth spread in Chloe's heart at the sight of it. Growing old with someone wouldn't always be perfect. Maybe it would mean sickness and heartache and wrinkly skin. But moments like this would make it worth it. Once finished, she offered a short nod to the Nashes and promised to return the next evening to check on Mr. Nash's progress. By the time Chloe returned to the wintry air outside, her full heart warmed her against the chill. It lasted 3 full steps before a tall figure just ahead forced her to jerk to a stop. She gulped as she glanced up, and then her entire body went rigid. She gasped. The man before her stood taller than the average mortal, but that wasn't too out of place. His pointed fake ears, on the other hand, would make anyone stare. Not to mention he had gloriously perfect features that made him impossibly attractive, especially for a mortal. Quintus. She spoke his name like a warning. If he weren't so beautiful, she would have glared. He never should have entered the mortal realm without masking himself with a glamour that made him appear more like an imperfect mortal. His eyes locked onto hers with a fervor she hadn't known since leaving Faerie. His expression commanded the utmost attention. Surely his voice would too. You have to return to Faerie.